Hello, and welcome to Work Cookie by CBOC. We are really excited to be speaking on workplace ethics this month. So, last week we did a little bit of a talk on technology ethics as well, which I'm sure is no surprise to bring forth as a topic area. But today we're going to take a little bit of a sidestep and we're going to talk about ethical leadership specifically. So, the topic of today was called Ethical Leadership Isn't Neutral: How Leaders Shape Moral Climate and Psychological Safety. And so there's a couple of different topics that I'll bring forth. Last week we did that as well, where we brought forth 3 or 4 different category areas where ethics and technology is relevant. And super excited to bring back Dr. Mishra today, who has been a guest here before, to talk about some of the real challenges we're seeing again. I'll put the references here in the chat, and a couple of them are actually Dr. Mishra's references here that talk about ethics from the standpoint of downsizing, right? So, what we are seeing happening all over in industries related to technology, but also really the market, things like tariffs have impacted organizations as well from a cost consideration standpoint. We're seeing a lot of organizations sharing out in the workplace that they are doing layoffs again, right? So, some key players that come to mind that I've seen recently are like Amazon, who I believe is the #1 employer in the world when it comes to the number of jobs that they have out there. And so, I mean, some really large numbers that organizations that are not just technology organizations, right? I understand that that's a big impact in my field these days, but really across the board, industry agnostic is this sort of trend again. And so let me go ahead and put these resources in the chat. Give me just a second to pull them up here for those who are here. So I'll start with just some notations that you're going to find within those references. If you go and pull the particular articles that are associated with them. But ethical leadership impacts a number of areas. And so we'll kind of start with what is ethical leadership, right? Ethical leadership is going to be related to the behavior of leadership. It considers honesty, trust in the leader, interactional fairness, and also considerations around charismatic leadership are in that particular in the reference list as well. On the negative side, right, abusive supervision is really that unethical side. And so you'll see some different themes coming up there, but some of the bigger findings in there, ethical leadership impacts ethical group behavior or team behaviors, if you will. It influences the climate that people work in, so the culture, the climate that you're going to find there as well, especially senior leadership. So your top level leaders will set the tone in the climate of the organization and in the environment that the workers have there. There's a relationship with the transparency of leaders and ethical leadership, as well as disengagement, which I think is, oh, I'm sorry, I think somebody needs to mute. We got some background noise there. There's a relationship as well then with, thank you. Relationship with disengagement as well. So we've talked about disengagement in a number of different ways. That's something that's also found in Dr. Mishra's writing as well, which talks about the downsizing, right, and the impact and disengagement with resources in the organization. There's also a lot of literature that's more recent that talks about insecurity and technology. So as we are integrating new technologies in our workplace, can be AI, robotics, or any number of systems, right? It does not have to be AI. I know that's really the buzzword of the time, but this is something that you can see historically, even when a new technology is introduced, there can be insecurity from the workers as well. And in Dr. Mishra's articles there, I wanted to bring forth one of the items related to innovation, since that is an area that I speak about and talk about a lot as well. And it said, in order for innovation to take hold during downsizing, managers must instill hope and craft a credible vision for the future. And so that really speaks then to the visioning process, where the resources can anchor to, and how they can really still stay engaged in the organization as changes occur. So I really would kind of like to start there. And Dr. Ishra, I'm going to put you on the spot here for a little bit to kind of speak a little bit to the writings that you've had out there, which I think we're seeing some of these same trends again happening in the modern workplace in different ways, right? And so I'd love to hear your perspective there.
Sure, thank you. And it's amazing to me. My late husband and I wrote this so long ago, and we thought, oh, people will learn and they'll never do downsizing again. So I know that was probably a very naive perception at the time. Um, but the one thing that we just noticed, because we actually wrote this when we returned to graduate school after living through General Motors downsizing. And the thing that we noticed living through that as employees is that innovation was completely decimated. Because one of the things that you end up doing is that you lose a lot of really good people because the best people are going to leave first when they notice what's happening because they can, right? And so then what are you left with? The people who are maybe a little worried about leaving because they either love their jobs or they love the security. And so then you're just left with no innovation, no creativity. And so when you're trying to get people to be innovative and creative, that's not where people's minds are. My late husband and then his colleague Gretchen Spreitzer went on to write about survivors, and that survivors are really, they're just there trying to survive. They're not there to be creative. So even if you as a leader saying, oh, this downsizing, now we can go forward, we can do really cool things. The people who are left, that's not where their brain is. Their brain is all about, I got to hang on to this job because this is my livelihood and my family's counting on me and I don't want to be next on the chopping block. So I'm just going to, check off my boxes to make sure I don't lose my job. So when you tell me to be innovative and creative, I'm like, that might be a risk, because I don't know what that necessarily means. And so sometimes that can be really risky. Like there's some organizations like Google who will say, okay, go take a certain percentage of your time and go be creative, and that's accepted. But there's a lot of organizations where that's not accepted and it is a risk. And you don't want to put yourself out there. You'd rather say, oh, I did my job the way you told me to, rather than I did my job because you said, oh, go do something a little different, but you don't like my different. So it's risky.
Yeah, for sure. And what that makes me think of is a conversation I've had recently about the changing power dynamics when it is an employer-friendly market or an employee-friendly market. And I think that is a critical point where an ethical leader must come forth because behavior should not change from the leadership level depending on who has the power in that dynamic, right? So when there are a lot of people looking for work. If the leadership behavior is then, just go ahead and get to work and be creative in a strong way, right? Messaging in a stronger way versus when there are a lot of jobs and you have your pick of employers, right? Being able to feel inspired and innovated that's a really interesting power dynamic there. And when you see leaders change their tone based on where we are in the spectrum of dynamics, I think to me that speaks to unethical leadership, right? That you don't really build trust. Curious to your thoughts on that.
Well, right, because you can then all the leaders could use that. I mean, I'm seeing that right now in some organizations. They can use that as kind of a source of, oh, you weren't on my downsizing list, now you are. Because they can say, well, you're not being creative in the way that I wanted you to. And the employee can say, well, you didn't actually give me the parameters for what you were looking for. Like I know the parameters of my job, but I don't know the parameters of innovation. But all of a sudden, I see this in a few different organizations who are doing kind of this quiet downsizing. There actually are a lot who are not announcing it. People are just seeing their colleagues all of a sudden are gone. And so then those people become even more nervous because they don't want to do anything outside the norm that puts them on that next list. So I think that just creates a lot of stress and tension for people.
Agreed. And I think from the practical standpoint, what do you think from the leadership side, right, are some behaviors or some actions that leaders should take in an environment to behave ethically and not use that power struggle to their advantage? I think is maybe that's not the right word, right? But to stand on that post of now I have the keys, and so I get to behave in a different way. How can leaders really combat that sort of change in their own tone?
Yeah, I think the one thing that we really advocated for is just being so transparent because that whole process, there's so much secrecy involved. Like nobody, especially right now with some of these organizations not even saying they're downsizing, but then they're letting people go. And people are so surprised by that. And then that causes a lot of stress. So I think being transparent as much as you can, even if you don't know all the facts, but just saying, look, we're in a rough time. It may result in some having to let some people go. But also being transparent about, look, maybe this hasn't been part of your job before, but we want to keep as many jobs as possible. So let's all try to be creative and how can we be innovative in order to grow our revenue? Because, honestly, we always advocated for that. That's a much better way to go than letting people go. Let's try to be creative and grow our organization. And so I think transparency is really the key. How can you just share as much information as you have with people? Because that just makes everybody feel better when they just know what the rules of the game are.
I love that. It's actually one of the seven elements in my leadership model. Transparency and trust is actually combined as an encapsulator on all the other elements. And in my perspective, particularly with technology change, there does need to be an appropriate level. And I understand that there are things that happen maybe at the boardroom level or at the C or senior leader level that cannot be shared or cannot be shared until a certain point, right? Even contractual obligations to
Right.
not disclose certain information at a certain point. But I think your point there, the transparency to the appropriate level, is a key behavior in providing an environment where people can also share what isn't going right. I think, and being able to have that two-way dialogue requires the leader's transparency at the onset. I just came out of a meeting very recently. We were doing kind of the kudos first and the great things first, right? And I almost felt like the person who brought up the first thing that was wrong maybe even felt in that moment, gosh, we're talking about great things. Maybe I shouldn't share this. But we very much encouraged that resource to bring forth the problem that they were sharing about. It is a very common and relevant problem for the team. And so providing that sort of an airspace and being very transparent, yet we can talk about both things here because there are good things happening with collaboration does not mean that we shouldn't bring forth the problem. Let's be transparent about that too. And I think that was a really critical moment for the team. They started sharing a little bit more and speaking up a little more on some of the things that could be better. And so thank you for that call out there. I think it's great.
Yeah.
Uh, Nick, I see your hand up. Let's go over to you.
I think one thing that jumps out to me in the current climate of downsizing, we talk about the power dynamics between job seekers, job havers. Is it a labor market? Is it a corporate market? All that. I think there's less connection between power and leadership now more than ever. Because your office leader, your CHO, your CFO, your CEO, whoever's in the driver's seat, they may also be beholden to the ownership, the shareholder, things like that. So I think that there's not as much clarity. We don't have that top-down captain of the ship driving the boat as much anymore. So leadership gets murky to a degree. And the flatter an organization, the more you kind of have to have leadership from within. And that, I think, most often now, leadership is what sets the tone for the culture of the organization. And so you may have, leaders by title, but you also have leaders by function, leaders by attitude, things like that as well. So I think part of the ethics of leadership at this point is, are you willing to stop in the middle of chaos and really just stand firm to whatever the vision, the mission, is. I'm not going to prescribe one to be, better than the other, but I think we can all kind of agree if we can take care of people, that's a really good place to start. And so, can you structure your decisions around that? Can you make those calls when the earnings are down, when the market is bleak, when there's chaos all around? Can you be that clear beacon for the people in your organization? And what does that look like? It does mean you have to have the discernment to have those hard conversations, to say, you know what, for the sake of all of us, like, we have to let some people go because there's not enough to go around. We'll love to have you back if things change quickly. I think it's Good to Great's got the example of, senior leadership taking pay cuts in the lean times so that people could stay. They made 80% so somebody else could make 100% and, keep food on the table and things like that. That humanistic element doesn't always get the press. We've got gravity payments up in Seattle where they said the minimum wage for everybody is a living wage of 75,000, or at least it was at the time, and caught a lot of flack. Oh, it'll never work. It'll never work. Well, it does seem to work even, 5-6 years later. And it's upsetting that more companies aren't taking that lead. We see a lot of the negative press, and I hope that there are good leaders out there that are doing it right. If they're in this room, I hope they will speak up as well.
Thank you, Nick. And I think you really spoke eloquently about the same thing that we shared at the beginning, crafting a credible vision of the future, which came from Dr. Mishra's article. There has to be that honesty and that credibility in that. And I love the point you made up there. I mean, there are what we would call radical behavior changes that people make as leaders, like taking a pay cut. I've even seen an article where someone wasn't paid for a whole year to keep their employees employed because they had been making $1 million every year before that, right? So their savings account could handle not having that income for that year, and their entire salary went to the resources. I mean, we call that a radical thing, but really, is it right? Is it that radical to say, I am going to go without so that my team members can go with? I'm not sure that's so radical, and I'm not sure why we call it that, right? So interesting conversation with that. I'm sure that there are plenty of leaders who will hear that and be like, "How dare you, Emmy?" Right? But I'm not sure it's radical. Chris, let's go over to you.
Thanks. I appreciate that. I wanted to ask a question about something that really stood out to me about what Karen had said. You'd mentioned that you know the parameters of your job, but not the parameters of innovation. And that sounds like something that strikes at a few things that I've experienced before. When innovation inherently means exploring maybe the edge or outside of the lines of your current work parameters, there's some risk associated with that. So I wanted to ask, what kind of conversations have you found help establish the parameters of innovation in work cultures where the psychological safety is not clear?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think what has to happen is that, because even one of my students former students who works for Google, she was put in that innovative part of Google where she was supposed to just be doing cool new things. And even she found there that she didn't have a lot of direction herself. And so I think part of those conversations is saying, okay, here's the parameters. These are the kinds of things we're looking for. Like, do we want to build on what we already have, or do we want to do drastic new things? And I think that sometimes leaders don't they just like, oh, be innovative. Okay, well, there's a lot of different directions we can go, right? We can just build, these are the things we're doing, so we can go incremental. But sometimes in order to grow, you actually have to do like dramatically different things, maybe go in a whole new direction, target a whole new segment. So I think the thing is, people just don't have those conversations. And I've even found in different organizations I've worked with, leaders will say, there was one school that I worked at, the leader was like, oh, okay, let's all brainstorm. Let's do all this. We spent a year doing this. And then at the end, the decision was, no, I've decided we're not doing that. And we're all going, but we really, if we're going to grow and we're not going to lose market share, we need to do these things. But, sometimes it's easier to just keep the status quo than to put yourself out there. So you can even try and come up with all these great ideas and still have your leader say, no, I don't think so, which is very frustrating, by the way.
Right. And I think something you spoke there too are really the types of innovation that can happen. So innovation, like you're saying, is not only creating something new and radical, although that is a type of innovation.
Right.
Innovation can also even be revising, right? So creating something new or better from something that existed before. And so I
Right.
think having that, like you're mentioning, that sort of guard railing, am I going to be incremental or iterative in my innovation? Am I allowed to be disruptive?
Right.
Is my innovation only supposed to sustain us and keep us at an equal level, or is it supposed to be radical in some way? Makes
Yeah.
me think of like Uber, who radically changed the transportation methods and modes of the entire industry or society at large. I use Uber even internationally when I go travel because I don't even like driving locally, so I definitely don't want to drive internationally. And so I use that as my common theme where, everywhere I go, that's one of the things I even check for. And that's really that radical disruption. But are you allowed to do that? And does a change in the organization change my parameters, change my guardrails, my gate, if you will? So thank you for that. I think the clarity there is critical. All right, Natasha, let's go over to you. Natasha, you're on mute if you're talking.
I wasn't talking yet. So, hi, thank you so much. This is a very important conversation that we're having today for three reasons. I think one of the things that managers really need to be mindful of is or I would say management and leadership, is to really, um, a huge part of the ethics of this whole conversation is being the ability to manage the communication. Layoffs, downsizing does not happen in a vacuum, especially within an industry. When other competitors are laying off, those are the times where either you're checking in with your CFO to know what are the books saying, and before we reduce our staff, are there other ways we can make cuts that don't impact people first? And impact other programming resources. Maybe it might be a 10% budget cut across the board or what have you. How do we go about this in a way that does not impact people first? And if there are other cost saving opportunities there, being able to clearly communicate that, hey, as a result of what's going down with the economy, with industry or whatnot, these are where we are making the cuts first because we do not want for any cuts that we make to impact people first. And then continue those conversations because your employees, again, are not children. They are not ignorant to what is happening. They're not oblivious from what's happening around them. And yes, they are concerned. They are wondering, when is this going to come to this organization, and will I be on the chopping block? And if the measures are not enough, that we now have to go towards downsizing, reducing, going to a reduction in force, this is where you clearly communicate, this is why we've done these measures first, and now we're at a place where we absolutely have to have these reductions in force. But be empathetic. And earlier, when you first started talking, Dr. Mishra, you mentioned, the loss that people have. The loss is not just from a job. The loss is not just from a standpoint of resources, of people, of intellect, as of company history. Um, you're also losing the people that you currently have, because for them, you've lost them because either A, they're thinking about jumping ship based on how you handled your reduction in force, B, considering reduction in shift, considering jumping ship because they either see the writing on the wall, or those who are still there are psychologically not present. Because again, as you mentioned, the concern of, am I next on that chopping block? And so leadership has a very important role, and in the process of, and the last layer of loss I would say that they lose is the trust of their employees. And so you gain that trust by how you begin at the onset of wherever you decide to make those cost savings, and how you communicate those cost savings, and how you manage the narrative of your reduction in force. Because we are now seeing in in this economy, or in this we're seeing now so many organizations that are being called out for how they have handled reductions in force. And no matter what they say, they have lost the narrative, the storytelling of their brand, their ethics, their values, and how they do business, all because they went about it the wrong way. And now the public was able to take that narrative and run with it. So when you control your narrative by controlling it from the onset, it helps in the restoring and the retaining of the trust of your employees, and communicate along the way. And the last point I really want to make real quickly is that during that reduction in force space, organizations tend to say, as a reassurance, we have an open door policy. Come to us and talk to us about any concerns. And on the back end of coming to talk to you about those concerns, oftentimes retaliation comes as a result of those conversations. I took advantage of the open door policy and I expressed my concerns, and all of a sudden I'm having performance issues. I'm next on that chopping block. And when you do that to employees, to individuals, trust and believe that they are not the only ones who know about their meeting with you. Their peers know about it. And when that person suddenly disappears, you know what does not disappear? The narrative that employees will now carry about you. You are not trustworthy, and open door policy does not mean open door policy.
Thank you, Natasha. I've actually shared that with a senior leader of mine before, who would explicitly state that in meetings, that I have an open door policy, and in a private meeting is shared. The need to explicitly state it almost implies that the environment actually does not allow it. And does our environment actually provide safety to do this without having to formally explain that it's available to you, right? It's almost counterproductive in that. And just as a follow-up to what you're saying, Natasha, there on the way that it is communicated when it's downsized. There was an organization that I worked for years and years ago who, post my being there, did a layoff in a really dramatic and unfortunate way to the employees that even left trauma with them. Everybody was invited to a Zoom. They said, if you're on this, you're going to get an email as soon as you leave, and you won't be here tomorrow, basically. No personal conversations with it. Some of these people were long tenured, had even personal relationships with the leader who was on this meeting saying this, right? So my follow-up question, and maybe Dr. Mishra, you can share some light here before we get to our next hand. Once you've done that, right? Once you've broken the trust, is there a way to repair it for those who are the survivors at the organization afterward, and make changes within the organization once the leader's already made that decision?
Yeah, that is exactly why we started on that path of research, because we just saw the damage at General Motors that happened. So many of our friends left that we had worked with. I was a co-op student there all through college. Even though I wasn't an engineer, I was one of the first liberal arts co-op students, and then worked there after college. And it was really devastating, and there were and a lot of, and even my husband and I were both still there. We didn't take the buyout. And so we were looking at each other like, is this the same place that we started with in college? You know, and it really makes you wonder, like, what is here for us? Is there a future here for us? What kind of organization is this that they would do this to so many really smart, good people? And then you could see the decimation of the innovation. If you look at in the 80s and just Google the Chevy Cavalier and the Cadillac, that at the same time, they look exactly the same. And that just shows you what they lost in engineering innovation at that time. And so that is the hard part. And that's why we did this research and wanted to share it with people, because we knew that the next part is the hard part. How you rebuild trust is so much harder than being intentional about being a trustworthy leader and doing the things that you have to do to be good to people. Because you already are off on the wrong foot. People already are suspicious of you, and they already are going to say, well, I already knew what you did and you did it wrong. Like, how do I trust you're not going to do that to me again? And so, especially if you're the person who did that wrong thing, it's almost better to bring in a new person who can say, okay, that was then, this is now, here's our new intention going forward. Because if you're the person who botched it, that's really, really, really hard to overcome. So, I mean, but there and again, if you look at what happened at Wells Fargo, they had to go through more than one CEO after their fiasco. And they're still trying to rebuild that trust. I talk to employees at the college I'm at. We have a lot of students who go work in that field. And, that's still, people still bring that up. So I know that that's still an issue. That they have to contend with, even after all these years of that event happening there.
Wow. That's and that actually is the route that this particular organization took. They put in new senior leadership after all that happened. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
CT, let's go over to you.
I'll put my hand down. When it comes to making decisions and ethical leadership and decisions that leadership makes, I think a lot of times ethics are dynamic or they're fluid. They're not necessarily fixed all the time. And what you may be observing is ethical leadership that's shifting based on the business environment, that's shifting because of interests and values have shifted. So you're seeing that reflected. So you're seeing ethics that is being aligned to, but it's changing. And those different interests, those values, they aren't always publicly communicated. They're communicated in private at certain levels, and certain people do know what they are, but other people won't. So what is communicated oftentimes is what you're seeing in the environment on your job. So that's what you see. So understanding the signals that's taking place is where it's incumbent on the employees to see that and say, okay, there's probably a shift that's happening, and it's up to leadership to communicate that, because we're not aware that things have shifted, your values, your expectations, what you want. And I think as employees, you should definitely pressure leadership to reconcile what we once knew to be true and what's happening now, if that makes sense. So I think that's what a disconnect is, because you're seeing what you're seeing. And it is what it is in a sense, you know what I mean? But it hasn't been said. It hasn't been said explicitly. It has been said implicitly. But I think it's up to us to broker the trust by pressuring leadership to be more explicit and broadcasting what those interests and values are now.
Thank you, CT. There's actually another episode coming up this month. If you take a look, it's going to be on that optics versus explicit or transparent nature of leadership. And I think what you're really speaking there to is that transparency piece and being explicit in there. So I really love you bringing that forth. Thank you for that. Definitely. And the situational piece, right? Are we shifting based on the environment, the situation, the needs of the resources, the community, the needs of the changing times, right? So thank you for that. Nick, let's go over to you.
Yeah, it's, I think the assumption is there's only one right way to do it. And I think there's a lot of commonalities between the leaders that do get it right And I do want to just throw up a hand and say there are leaders out there that are getting it right, because I think it's easy to kind of blame them as the, Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, pulling the strings and manipulating everybody's life. And they do wield that level of power and influence. And so they should, consider the little guy. But, we've talked about some of the other pressures there as well. I think one thing that, to CT's point a little bit, you would hope for alignment between what does the organization do, what is the leader rewarding, all these sorts of things. And that's hard to get as an individual, let alone as an organization. And I do appreciate, the thought that, it is about making a choice. It is making the strategy. It is standing and making a stand. I mean, even the topic today says, leadership isn't neutral. You are going to push in a direction one way or another. You're going to listen to one voice or another. You, as a leader, have to figure out what voices you're listening to and put those into play so that your conscience is clear. I would say there are, some relativistic things that can change, but I think when we get to a broad sense of right and wrong, it gets a little bit clearer. And again, I will go back to being the starry-eyed humanistic optimist that says it's about people, whether that's the people that are signing your paycheck, whether that's about the people that are buying your product, or whether that's the people that are working for you. The other thing that jumps to mind is we think about this oftentimes in a large organization setting. I think about just my little small restaurant that I'm in, husband and wife running the show. And, it's very open. My kids go to school with theirs. And so I see just the everyday life. And I also see, the dishwasher broke. It's easy to think, they've got it. They run a successful business. Well, yeah, but on a smaller scale like that cost still has a very real impact and a real stress to make sure that not only can the business keep running, but that they can employ and enable people to make money as well. And I see that weigh very heavily on them a lot of the time. COVID, for example, was kind of a blessing and a curse. How do we keep people working? I was thankful to be one of the people that got the call to say, hey, do you want to come back? But it was kind of a natural breaking point. Just to say, this person's problematic. We can't find a good reason to let them go. We know they're disruptive, and all of that. And I think that is another side of leadership, is kind of that police force and that engagement to say, what are we really doing? How are we going to do it? What do we allow? What do we don't? And so just taking care of the bad actors as well as the good is something that I think allows people to shy away from leadership, because I don't want to have the hard conversations. I don't want people not to like me. And there is so much charisma and popularity tied up in leadership as well.
I appreciate that perspective, Nick. And I think sometimes leaders, especially maybe before you get to senior leadership levels, don't really recognize the power and influence that they have to be able to make impacts in the individual contributor level. And it's such an interesting thing. I think I see it a lot in my space in technology, where you are technically good and you are raised because of your technical excellence into a leadership position, but you're not really provided the management or leadership development resources to help understand how impactful you are as a leader to others now at that individual contributor level, and helping steward them and their work. So thank you for that, Nick. Rich, let's go over to you.
Yeah, I've been doing this for how many years and I can't press the mute button. And
I think Rich froze.
anyway, all right. So, Dr. The article, what's that? Oh, did I freeze?
You didn't, but you're back.
I'm back. Okay, good. Sorry about that. I was going to say I have a question for Dr. Mishra regarding the MIT article from 2009, where you were exploring how organizations are the way to help people with organizations with downsizing is how organizations must become more flexible, how they must become more innovative and creative, how they must improve their communications with stakeholders, those being the three things that were mentioned in the abstract. My question is that, framing this from leadership training that I just went through LinkedIn Learning with this um, cannot remember the guy's name now. Forgive me. I can put it in the comments here, right? But what he was talking about was moving. When you have people who are underperforming in one area, or you need to reduce expense or costs, or whatever it is that requires a downsizing, right? To move them into some other part of the organization based on their skills. In your research, did you see anybody doing that type of adaptability, or was it what we've often seen as there's a massive layoff over on there, or even a partial layoff over on this side of the organization, yet we have a huge amount of recruitment happening at the same time, which arguably defies. I mean, it certainly psychologically affects the people who are losing their positions to people who are coming in, and all of that. There's certainly some cognitive dissonance that can happen with that, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah. No, that definitely happens because, a lot of times what they're doing in organizations is they're getting rid of the expensive people, but they're still recruiting the entry level people.
sure.
And so, when we have so many generations working together at work, that is really not great for building positive relationships across generations, because the people who are losing their jobs are not very happy about that. But then, the younger people, I can just tell you right now, because I'm teaching all these young people, they are so stressed about finding jobs when they see all these layoffs. It just is very, very discouraging to them. But to your earlier question, one company that we followed from the very beginning is called Rhino Foods. They're out of Vermont. They make all the cookie dough for Ben and Jerry's. So you may have never heard of Rhino Foods, but if you love Ben and Jerry's, you've definitely had their cookie dough. And they're a family-owned business. They're just the coolest business. They started because the man who started it, he didn't get the head coaching job at the University of Vermont, so he just went to help his wife who was selling ice cream. And they just built this powerhouse company as a couple. And he recently gave the reins to his son. But one of the things that Ted did when they went through a little slump before they exploded with their cookie dough was that he realized he needed to, he didn't want to lay off people. So instead, what he did is he just called everybody he knew in his city in Vermont and said, look, I've got a little bit of a downturn here. Can you please take my employees? Do you need extra people? So he just sent his best people. He could have just said, I'm going to send the people who are not as performing as well, but he sent his best people to these other colleagues at other places in his city so that all of his employees would be employed. And then as soon as he could bring them back, he did. And so it did a lot of things by doing that, right? I mean, his employees were so grateful that they could keep working. These colleagues of his in the city were so grateful because he sent his best employees. So they got some cross training and built great relationships in that community. And so we saw that example, and then we've kind of built on that since then, because one of the things I've done is become a Gallup certified strengths coach. So I always encourage companies, look, if people are not working in a situation, don't automatically go to, oh, I'm going to fire you because you're not working here. Well, maybe it's not their strengths. Maybe you saw something in them because you brought them into the organization, but maybe they really are better suited somewhere else. One of my MBA students took one of my strengths courses because I try to build it into some of my MBA courses. And she went back to work the next week and she had everybody do it. And she rearranged her entire team because she said, you know what? I was trying to fit people into places where they didn't fit. And I realized that I should use their strengths and then rearrange our whole team. And she said, everybody's so much happier. And I think that is a better strategy too, than just trying to force people into places. So I'm not sure if I answered your question or not. But.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting that a lot of colleges, I teach at Trinity Christian, and they use the Strengths Finder there too, right? So, for the record, I'm restorative, individualization, empathy, responsibility, and developer. So and so I have my students understand that too when I'm working with them on resumes and the like, and then when we talk about careers. But it seems that, when they well, first of all, if it's not reinforced in the classroom, they don't remember any of it, right? So, and then of course, then you move it into the job, and it doesn't even really I don't know any employer that I've gone to yet who uses that instrument, not just for selection, right? I mean, there's arguments for and against that, right? But within leadership development and within putting people the right people in the right seats and keeping them there, there doesn't seem to be this strengths based approach, even though we say we're in a skills based economy, right? So,
I'm working on it.
Okay, good. Well,
I mean, whenever I have the chance to do a leadership workshop for an organization, I always do strengths with them.
That's great.
For precisely that reason. So one of the topics somebody mentioned was engagement. So I don't know if you follow Gallup's engagement work, but we're at a low right now. 30% of employees.
30%, yeah.
I mean, that's appalling, right? But it's because employers are just not doing a great job at the two big things right now that they're not doing well is they're not developing people in their roles, and they're not really giving people performance expectations. So, to get back to the idea of innovation, if people don't even know what they're expected to do in their day-to-day job, how can they go beyond that and be innovative? I mean, that's a real problem that managers and leaders and organizations really, I think, need to address if they ever expect to get more engagement among employees.
Sure.
Yeah.
It makes me think real quick, if I can just say one more thing, like Dr. Heather Morton does, works with people as a coach and uses particularly the Holland codes, right? So using strengths along with our work preferences, right? It makes a lot of sense. But again, even though ONET uses a reduced version of the standard SDS, in their My Next Move, we still don't see a lot of organizations actually using that in that process of essentially, if we tie this to ethics, doing no harm and non-maleficence and beneficence, right? We don't really see that being employed in there, at least in my experience. Yeah.
One of the things that I've heard both of you really also talking about there is this concept of really being creative in difficult situations as a leader. We all often talk about the employees being creative, right? But the leadership creativity to really reconfigure teams, we're talking about with strength rights there, or to reconfigure even the status quo within organizations. Dr. Mishra, you talked about a leader who found employment for employees until they could really bring them back. I think about a local donut shop that we've had here that partnered with a neighborhood barbecue maker, and they made barbecue kolaches as their new featured item. And all of a sudden, the place was on fire again, right? So these are really creative moves that people make to be able to keep resources employed versus going through kind of the standard checklist at the leadership level of doing the things that harm the employees, or as you're talking about, Rich, there's the unethical side of it, right?
Barbecue kolaches. Wow.
They're fantastic. Okay.
That is innovative. Oh man.
Yeah,
things are big in Texas.
Hey, they are. We know our barbecue here. Okay,
yes, that's right.
For sure. Right Natasha, let's go over to you.
Yeah, Dr. Emmy, I truly enjoy, I appreciated the comment you made about managers being creative and leadership being creative and agile in terms of reconfiguring their teams or even roles and responsibilities, right? Because too often in management, we tend to see them being decision makers or reactive but not necessarily the creative component of it. Creativity is often left to the employee. But, I wanted to go back. There is a part of the ethics of it all that came to mind as the conversation was going on, and it is that of the credibility. Oftentimes, again, organizations might lose credibility based on how they handle everything. In terms of, are layoffs always the answer? Last week we talked about artificial intelligence, AI, and I had mentioned that because of the unknown, the uncertainty, the inconsistency of AI, it can never, its reliance and, just it being inclusive and ethical enough to be an end all be all. We can't it can never replace human intelligence. Well, we have a lot of organizations that had a lot of experienced a lot of layoffs as a result of the introduction of artificial intelligence. They believed that AI was going to replace everyone that was here and was going to get the work done faster, more efficiently, and the list goes on. Well, quietly, there are a lot of these companies, to include Google, that are slowly but surely bringing these people back. Because what they are now realizing is that AI is coding things sloppily or incorrectly, and they can't go back and correct those codes. So, oops, we actually do need coders. We actually do need human intelligence, right? And so when that now happens, you lose credibility of your employees, because what your staff will tell you is, we could have told you so. But again, it goes back to how you go about it. Yes, the bottom line of an organization is always your bottom line, but you still have to think about the people, because as America ran after Mitt Romney, and I'm not trying to be political here, the organization is the people. And I'm not even going to go into the binder, but, and I think that, to that point, organizations really have to figure out, are there other alternatives to letting go of our people, or are layoffs truly the answer? And if layoffs are not truly the answer, if layoffs are truly the answer, how do you do so collaboratively to ensure that you're doing it correctly? So it's not just a decision that you make with your CFO, but it's also conversations that you loop in HR and head of divisions to understand if this is the wise decision to make. Because ultimately, just like those other organizations, you might end up pulling your staff back in or hiring again, and you have already lost the credibility of those that are employed by you.
Agree. And I think the credibility piece is critical to bring forth in discussion as well. I think once you lose credibility as a leader, as Dr. Mishra was saying earlier, it is so hard to get that back. She mentioned you may even just have to bring in another leader, depending on how severe that loss of credibility, loss of trust, or change in the culture through a decision has made. And that's something that leaders have to live with.
The thing that is scary, though, is not all leaders care about their reputation and credibility. So the first article that we wrote for Sloan was based on a study we did for this company. We'd been doing some downsizing research. They found out about it and they said, hey, would you come help us? We're getting a bad reputation in our community and we have to pay. There's a WARN Act where the government says you must give 90 days notice before downsizing. Otherwise, you get hit with a fine. And so they said, in combination of these two things, would you please help us put together a plan so that we can preserve our reputation and not get this fine? So we spent time in their organization, interviewing people, kind of figuring out their processes. And, in combination with our research, we came up with this great plan. We presented it and they looked at us and they said, we're just going to take the fine. Yeah. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. The whole reason for this engagement was you were worried about your reputation and you didn't want to pay the fine. And now you're saying it's too much, because basically they were saying what you were proposing is it's too much work. We don't want to have to go to all this
Wow.
effort. We just want to, we don't care what people think of us. We're just going to take the fine.
Wow. I know people listening to this later will not be able to see how far my jaw dropped
Isn't that
during
sad?
that, but it was unbelievable. That's really, and it really is that sort of a cost risk analysis for leaders in a, is this worth my time? And in this case, you're like, you know what, it's not. And that's really, really sad. And then that to me is one of those things at the leadership level that is so challenging to deal with for those who are trying to develop leaders, for those who are working with leaders, for those who are leaders. Wow, unbelievable. So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that example. I think that's, it really does speak a lot to the variability in the attitude and the ethical nature of leadership across the board. Nick, we've got a few minutes left. Let's go to you.
Yeah, that is astounding. And I mean that the Warren Act brings up just a whole nother set of complications. Where do you want to spend your money? Do you want it in reputation management and fines? Do you want to develop people and shift them over to other parts of the organization? I think there's so many organizations that like, I don't want to train because it doesn't work. I just want somebody to come in and do it. And I think that's where leadership needs to, really take the long view, because you can be disrupted for 2 months trying to get somebody up to speed. And then you have somebody who will do that job for you, where you can go and focus and be innovative and try and find the next big thing. So I think that the training and development side of it is so very, very huge, but it doesn't always pay dividends. It doesn't have a straight line. It doesn't have a one-to-one, I did this and then this exact thing happened. No, I was teaching somebody communication skills and we found out they were really great with numbers. So we put them on the finance team or anything like that. I think that's the flexibility that leadership has to have. I think one of the other complicating factors is the litigious nature of the workplace now, wrongful termination, all these sorts of things. There are a lot of hoops to be wary of. And I would say that anybody who is ethical wants to be on the right side of current laws, or at least not on the wrong side of them, and adhere to those policies, whether, if you don't like them, go about the process to change them to some degree or another. But I think that, sometimes policy doesn't get made until somebody screws up, and I think on a larger scale, that's laws and such as well. So I think that things that are designed to be safeguards have now kind of hamstrung leaders to a degree. Not that they should be able to run roughshod and I'm just going to take the fine sort of decisions, but ultimately I think that there are things that I don't want to make this mistake because it has even on a smaller scale. If I forget to ID somebody at the table, I can lose my job for that. If I hire somebody for a skill that's not job related, I've discriminated and now I can lose my job for that. And so those sorts of decisions that, whether the leader sees it or it's a complete blind spot, the impact their decisions have is very, very real. And again, getting to that alignment to say, this is who I want to be and how I want to do things. And this is the organization I want to be a part of. It's simple on paper, but a whole lot more complicated when you start bumping into other people.
For sure. Thank you for that, Nick. I think one of the things we can do better in the IO field, or at least be more explicit about, you're saying there's really not the direct line to the impact, but being explicit about what the indirect line is. What is the cost, impact, or risk if you don't develop someone in terms of disengagement, of job loss? What are the benefits? And what is the value, the dollar sign value of investing in this employee and growing them versus the other options or scenarios that you can? I think that's where partnering across disciplines, right, with business leaders, with those who you really can cultivate some numbers conversation with, is going to be a great step for IOs to be able to take, to be able to explain the true value of your work, and then conversely, the risk of not doing these things. That's really been, I think, something I've been speaking to in the tech space a lot. What's the risk of being unethical when you're implementing things? And then case of fines, attorney fees, what are those things, right? And building a story and a narrative there. But I think the entire IO sphere can really benefit from having some hard numbers to really point to in the value, though, even if they are indirect. So thank you so much for that, Nick. We are at time here. This conversation was phenomenal. I thank you so much, Dr. Mishra, for coming back. Are there any final thoughts you'd like to share before we close out today?
Thank you for the invitation. It was great conversation. I appreciate all the great questions and comments, and it's really an important topic. I really never thought that we would still be talking about things like this many years later, but it's obvious that there's still a lot that organizations need to learn from all of us.
Agree wholly. Next week, we are going to be talking about this dynamic of ethics versus optics and when corporate purpose becomes performance. And I almost didn't bring this topic forth, to be honest, because there are some things happening in our current time right now where you're getting letters from CEOs that are very much on the optics side versus the ethics side. But I thought it was really important as a leader. We can't shy away from the hard topics. That's the whole point of the topic in the first place. And so that is why I decided, yes, let's move forward with that one. So for anyone who hears this and wants to join in next week, that's going to be our conversation there from the organizational level, from the leadership level. How do we stand in ethics versus optics of the moment? So thank you again, Dr. Mishra, for being our guest today. And we'll see you again in 1 week's time. 3, 2, and 1.